Today, we're going to talk about Gutenberg to Bodoni and mechanical printing. In 1455, in Mainz, Germany, Gutenberg published the famous Bible commonly known as the Gutenberg Bible, a huge two-volume work comprised of 1,282 42-line folio pages. So this was really quite impressive. Of Gutenberg's 48 surviving Bibles, 3, including this one, are at the New York City's Pierpont Morgan Library. So if you ever get to New York, this would be a great time to actually go and see one of the original Gutenberg Bibles. The Gutenberg press is integral to how the Gutenberg Bible works. And here we can see another version of the press, an actual image. And the press was made from the idea of a wine press. And the thought was to be able to take movable type and be able to put it in a row to make your words and be able to do sheets over and over and over again. And there's an excellent video in the video content section, and it shows a person actually using a Gutenberg press. So I really think you should go and watch that. So here's some of the Gutenberg type. The initial effort was aimed not at creating a new kind of typeface, but at reproducing what handmade type looked like. And so here we can see the majuscule and the minuscule. He provided numerous versions of letters complete with all the eccentricities of medieval handwriting. This is a variant of Gothic script called textura, a word that refers to the dense spiky letter forms that we see on the side. So those little flails that kind of come out. They fill the completed page, giving it a textured look. Textura was an example of black letter type. Black letter type simply means type that resembles handwriting of medieval scribes. So whenever you hear that term black letter, that's what we're talking about. It's supposed to kind of refer to handmade lettering from actual scribes and monks during the time frame. So he provided all these different versions there. We can see an actual image of one of his pages. He made type with a temporary plaster mold. One letter would be cast. The process of taking that letter out of the mold disturbed the surface of the mold, so the same mold would have to be recreated to make a second letter, and so on. So this was a very time-consuming process. We also know that he didn't actually invent the process. Historical accounts often credit Gutenberg with inventing metal molded type for printing, but Gutenberg was born in Mainz, Germany, and around 1400 he began his career as a metalworker, but because of political turmoil in Mainz, he moved to Strasbourg, then a German city, and he began making mirrors for pilgrims they could hold above their heads to get a better view of sacred relics when they were in a crowd. And hopefully catch some of the relics magic, like from the glow of the mirror and reflection in the mirror. But Gutenberg may have used sand casting to create molds for his mirrors, and we think that may be part of where he got some of the idea for the castings for the letters. So at the same time, there was demand among pilgrims for religious trinkets and papal indulgences, which basically what that meant was that they would give the owner, because they purchased this papal indulgence, that they would have like a reduction in their time in purgatory if they had done bad things. But multiple copies of documents had to be written out laboriously by hand. So Gutenberg, who never wrote down his printing methods, probably came up with the idea of using sand casting from his mirror making. But the first known actual movable type system was invented in China by Bai Xing, this character, out of ceramic between 1040 and 1048 Common Era, so a good 400 years earlier. The Koreans had been using sand casting to make metal letters and had already been mass producing books for at least 30 years, but scholars have found no direct evidence that Gutenberg had any contact with anyone from Korea or from China. So metal movable type invented in Korea, and of course the ceramic type invented in China, led to printing in their particular continents. But it's long been known that the Chinese were making movable type out of clay and mass producing books in the 11th century. And we believe, though, that that was unknown in Europe. So even though he wasn't the first person to make any type of movable type, he definitely was the first person in Europe. And of course, his Bible really influenced the world. Johannes Gutenberg introduced what is generally regarded as the independent invention of movable type in Europe, along with innovations in casting the type based on a matrix and a hand mold. Gutenberg was the first to create his type pieces from an alloy of lead, tin, and antimony, and it's basically the same type of elements that were used in printing throughout the 20th century. To print his books, Gutenberg built a press modeled on the type used in winemaking, like I'd said earlier, and he also used it for bookbinding and paper making. He also developed oil-based ink. That is a prototype of the modern printer's ink that we see today. Around 1450, he began printing multiple copies of Papal Indulgences, a Latin grammar and prophetic poem about the fate of the Holy Roman Empire. When Gutenberg defaulted on his business loans, the printing business he started was bought out by Johann Fuchs and Peter Schoeffer. They printed the lavish Main Psalter, and this represents an important development in printing because it comprised not just printing, but it added woodcuts to the printing. This became the basis for centuries in letterpress printing. And there we can see these beautiful letters, this hand-carved piece, and it was done in wood, and then there was multiple printing going on over the top. So he wouldn't make a cast for all of that like script work that we see in the red and all those little like kind of bubbly shapes and the plant-like shapes in the bee. That would be made out of wood. So Roman style type was in competition to the heavier black letter type forms because it was more readable. Here's a detail of the Nicholas Gens Evangelica Purpuratio from Venetia in Urbe. This typeface is from 1470. Jensen studied in Mainz but had an eye for clearly legible forms. Around 1500, Aldus Manutius, a Venetian humanist and printer, published the first work in Roman italic base. This was kind of based on cursive writing. The italic was not used as a subset to create emphasis. It was like it is today. It was its own style. More words could fit on a page in italic typefaces than earlier Gothic or Roman styles. Aldus Manutius also produced Roman-style type faces as well. And here's a detail from Di Atina, Bembo typeface from 1495. This type, designed called Bembo, was considered more readable and harmonious than similar types produced by Jensen. While the letters are more legible, they are also quite stylish. Look at the midbar for the F. So see how the F is kind of curved at the top, really quite beautiful. And it's elongated merely for aesthetic purposes. And that's where we really start to see sort of this aesthetic feeling. And there we can see, you know, the ascenders and descenders and so on. This style is part of the New Testament and uses a Schwabacher typeface from 1522. Also, again, note the stylish capital letters, really quite beautiful. The S's, the D's, and so on. Here we can see a type that was designed by Geoffrey Torrey. He studied in Italy and then returned back to France in 1505, and he inspired Roman letter forms and sort of Renaissance ideals in the letter form. So there we see this very plant-like kind of illumination or illustration happening. And look at the little character right below the T, very cute. Here we start to also see type comprised solely on human dimensions. So here, Torrey was the first royal printer. This print is from an engraving by Geoffrey Torrey dated to 1529. Geoffrey Torrey was a pioneer in French printing, wood engraving, and designer. He also was an orthographer, publisher, author, and official printer to King Francis I. During the 15th and 16th centuries, Geoffrey Torrey, along with Aldus Manutius, Albrecht Dürer, Leonardo da Vinci, and others, explored proportions of the human body in their work. And in keeping with that proportional theory of Vitruvius, Torrey attempted to apply mathematical principles to the art of lettering. Torrey, much like Albrecht Dürer, demonstrated the idea that absolute proportions of what they called Attic, A-T-T-I-C, Attic letters, or Roman letters, could be developed according to the proportions of the human form. In 1529, he published a great work called Champfleury, subtitled The Art and Science of Proportion of the Attic or Ancient Roman Lettering, according to the human body and the human face. The most famous example of the Renaissance pursuit of an ideal proportion between humanity and lettering was achieved and recorded in this book. Typographers had struggled with the problem of developing a formula for the design of capital Roman letters, and a question Torrey effectively addressed in his work, Champfleury. He advocated a number of other reforms, including the use of accents and the sedilia, the apostrophe, and other punctuation marks that exerted a profound influence not only on orthography, but on language itself, just as it's written today. Born only 30 years after the invention of Gutenberg movable type printing press, Geoffrey Torrey, together with Claude Garamond and Robert Grandjean, were among the greatest printers of the French Renaissance. And there we can see a little better image of, from their book. Here's kind of a look at Garamond. Garamond was a French printer and typographer. He made another important contribution to typography. One of them was the adaptation of Mantuis's Bembo typeface. He made it more refined than the original and is a startling change from that heavy kind of French Gothic typefaces that were contemporary at the time. Garamond also sort of followed the path that was paved by his mentor, Geoffrey Torrey. So he had worked with Torrey. So it was a changing world, and here we can see, look at how tiny these little typefaces are. I really think this is a great image to sort of show you, just the complexity of making these little tiny typefaces. Garamond was introduced in 1541 and is known as the first old-style Roman font. So like you hear terms like Times New Roman or old-style Roman, that's where it's coming from. And Garamond is still being used today, which I think is absolutely amazing. It has remained popular for hundreds of years. So with the changing world, we start to see, what kinds of things are being reproduced. So initially it was fueled, the printing industry was fueled by the reproduction of classical texts of antiquity. And then it was fueled by the development of new books, the kinds of books that we found in science. So these factors led to the development of books as elements of propaganda and also of religious education. This is not to argue that print drove all the changes, but clearly it did not. There were social and political and economic changes that made print important because suddenly now, because books were more available to everyday people, more people were learning to read. And when more people would learn to read, they could learn to ask questions, right? And so we think about how that affected so many things, especially the Reformation. These changes might not have happened as quickly, or perhaps maybe they didn't happen at all if print hadn't been made. But I guess that would be a question if we would be able to go back in time and not make print available. So this is Romain du Roi, meaning the Roman type of the king, du Roi. The French royal government was a great patron of typography. Louis XIV instituted a state policy through which the arts could be funded and controlled through the government. Cardinal Richelieu oversaw the building of a royal printing work. In 1692, the king ordered royal typefaces be created. After years of discussion, Philip Grandjean was employed to cut the typeface, and this typeface would influence the rest of Europe for probably the next 100 years or so. Another French typographer, Pierre-Simon Fournier, made a major contribution in 1737 when he invented the first point system for measuring the type. So we often hear 2 point, 12 point. This goes all the way back to the 1700s. Fournier's system was part of a trend of treating typography with this rational, kind of empirical thinking, just like a scientist. He used a scale based on inches, which were devised by 72 points. So there would be 72 points in 1 inch. It's the same point system that we use today. He also published the first encyclopedia of typefaces, and there we can see an image of that. Here's a kind of a look at the way typecasting would work, and there's the mold, and here would be the matrix and the punch, and then eventually it would turn into the actual type. And there we can see the counterface. Notice that's backwards. Bevel, the shoulder, the point size, because that would be how wide it would be, and the feet and the groove, so that you could be able to keep it in from moving. So let's take a look at typography. So when we think about typography, first of all, we have to look at points and picas. So a pica is a unit of measurement used by a printer. 1 pica is 1/6 of an inch, or approximately 4 millimeters. A point, on the other hand, is a unit of measure also used by the printer, and the typefaces are measured in points. There are 12 points in a pica, or 72 points in an inch. So you can see how they're related. And here we can see that broken down on a ruler. So there we can see our pica, our 1 inch point. So we're 6 points in a pica, 12 points, 6 points in a, 6 picas in an inch, and 12 points in a pica, which would equal 72 points in an inch. Another thing that we saw with typography are serifs. So they're usually found on capital letters, T, H, and I, for example. Serif typefaces are considered easier to read in the body of a text because it moves us from one letter to the next. So just like cursive, where the letters are linked, it helps us read it as a whole rather than as separate letters. But computers have really changed that quite a bit. This is possible because the serifs carry the I from one letter to the next. And once computers came out, we started to see a lot more of sans serif typefaces. So there are no serifs, sans meaning no. These fonts are considered a better choice for headings or banners, but now because of computers, we see them quite a bit in body copy. They're often easier to read than serif fonts for a short amount of words, but because they've been used so much in computers, the human eye has basically learned how to read them quicker. So here we have what's called a fillet, and that's a kind of angled area, and there's a fillet on the serif. So a font. What is a font? A font is a complete assortment of letters and symbols in one size and style. This includes upper and lowercase letters, numerals, punctuation marks, brackets, and any other special characters. So the whole thing is called a font. A series is a complete collection of different sizes of the same style of type. The only difference between fonts and a series is their size. So there you can see 9 point, 12 point, 18 point, 36 point, 48 point, 72 point of Pegasus style of font. Display type. What is display? So display usually is any type that's larger than 12 points. This size is used for headlines in newspapers, chapter headings in a book, titles of your essay paper. This is also used in advertising on signs and posters. The size calls attention to whatever is set in the display font, and so a display type. So that is why we use it, to sort of set somebody off as to why they're going to use it. What is a family? So a family is fonts is a collection of fonts that have the same name but different styles. So a style change can include bold, italic, condensed, expanded, outline, and shadow, etc. The only requirement is to belong in the same family, is that they have the same basic name. Here's an example of Garamond's family of fonts. So we also saw letters that were made of wood, and they were called wooden block letters. And during the Age of Information, printed copies of Martin Luther's 95 Theses spread across Europe and sparked the Protestant Reformation. Those are some of the biggest effects of printing, alongside of the development of manuscript books, and with a focus on outside the secular world, maps began to evidence similar concerns. So it was not just like, writing, but also where we're going and if the world was flat. So, although this map predates the last 15th century map, it shows a rising secular concern in representation. For instance, it shows India just below the Garden of Eden. I know it's kind of hard to read. It also has rivers, and real name places in it, and other geographical relationships. So, right next to religious icons. Here's another map where we start to see, just the way things were changing. The period between the 13th and the 16th century saw the rise of a print-dominated society, and this was amazing changes. And the only thing you can compare it to is the kind of information age of the computer and how that changed the world. And most of you that are listening to this lecture are probably born digital. So, you'd have to talk to your grandparents or your parents maybe to understand the difference of how the world was and how much computers changed the world. So that was really what happened with print. When the print-dominated society moved away from the church's monopoly of information, and that monopoly existed only because they controlled how the books were made because they were handmade. Now anybody could get a printing press and start to make, and if they could purchase the print, they could print whatever they needed to print. In typography, a typeface, of course, is set on one or more letters and one or more font sizes designed with stylistic unity, each comprising of a coordinated set of glyphs. A typeface usually comprises an alphabet of letters, numerals, and punctuation. Just to kind of go over that. It may also include ideograms and symbols or consist entirely of them. For example, mathematical or map-making symbols could be a particular font or typeface. The term typeface is frequently confused with font. The two terms had more clearly differentiated meanings before the advent of the computer. And now with the computer, we basically interchange them. And I don't know if it's going to go to common usage and change in the dictionary. It may, but I definitely encourage you to look up font and typeface in the dictionary. Here's more inventions. Francesco Grifo, also called Francesco della Bologna, was a 15th century Venetian punch cutter. He worked for Aldus Mantuis, designing the printer's more important typefaces, including the first italic, coming from the word Italian, type. His Romans show a degree of abstraction from calligraphy not present in the work of the earlier Jensen, and his italic and Greek types are notably cursive. Just as Mantuis had achieved a monopoly on italic printing and Greek publishing with the permission of the Venetian government, he had a falling out with Grifo. In 1516, after he returned to Bologna, Grifo was charged with murder of his son-in-law, who had been beaten to death with an iron bar. This is his last appearance in the historical record. But the first italic typeface based on Chancery script and handwriting can definitely be attributed to him. Very little is known about the circumstances of his life. This is Lodovico Arrighi, and he started his career as a writing master in Venice, although that also is disputed. But here's like the way he would set up his typeface. Here's another. Around 1510, he was a bookseller in Rome, and he was employed as a scribe by the Apostolic Chancery in 1515. His experience in calligraphy led him to create an influential pamphlet on handwriting in 1522, and it was named La Apparina, which was the first book devoted to writing the italic script known as Chancery cursive. Albrecht Dürer also was a German painter, printmaker, and theorist, and he was from Nuremberg. Here we see Albrecht Dürer, a younger painting of him, an older painting. And here we can definitely see his construction of the letter B and the way that he was looking at sort of the rationalness, just like we saw earlier with Torrey and with Geoffrey Torrey and with Jensen and even Grifo. And now we see, and we know that Dürer went to Italy. And so we're sure that, he probably, when constructing alphabet, looked at those Italian kind of rational forms of type and French forms of type. This is Caslon. It was introduced in 1734. Caslon designed over 200 typefaces known by his name, and it was based on what called Dutch typefaces. Caslon became the most influential typeface produced in England. Caslon is considered a transitional Roman in that it is more vertical and it orients the stress on finer serifs than the old style typefaces. So you'll notice that the line weight changes and the serifs are thinner. Transitions like Caslon appear more fluid than those of the old style. Caslon was introduced in 1734, and he was used in the first printing of the. You might even like see this typeface and say, "Oh, that looks a little familiar." That's because it's actually the first printing of the Declaration of Independence and also the United States Constitution were both done in Caslon. Old style typefaces designed to imitate handwriting were good, but book typefaces like Caslon became highly legible and became popular very quickly. Old style typefaces, here we can see these are called like ligatures. So you can see how the F's like join together and the L and so on, and the difference between a typeface that uses a ligature and those that don't. And then here we can see a little bit of the kind of a bad print of the Declaration. Definitely go and look that up. Another typeface that I want to mention is Baskerville. This is Old Face from 1906. Acquired from Reed Foundry. Originally, it was cut at the Fry Foundry around 1764. Some people say it goes all the way back to 1750. Larger sizes were used to complete the Georgian Old Faced series. Most of the body sizes were original. Baskerville's designs were condemned for what was perceived as a stark, almost unfinished quality to them. People didn't like the extremes in the width. So look at the top of the H and then the thickness that comes to the bottom part of after the shoulder of the H. Baskerville had to invent new inks in order to make the slender, delicate shapes of his letter forms stand out, because otherwise the other stuff sort of, would bleed into the paper. This is the first Egyptian, what we call Egyptian slab serif. So this thick, fat slab, we see this a lot in Old West posters and things like that, Old West printings. This is Vincent Figgins, 1815. Here's another version. He created these sort of hollow versions. Here's another 1816 version of Caslon without serifs. Here's another Robert Thorne. William Thorogood was an English type founder, and he buys the Robert Thorne Foundry and establishes himself as an independent. But these are typefaces that were designed by Thorne. There you can see that really fat, thick typeface. Here's those, back to those, remember those flayed serifs that we saw, or flayed designs that we saw early on in black letter. Here we're kind of reinventing those in 1821, and we call that a splayed serif. Another thing that happens out of all this printing are periodicals. So merchants would distribute newsletters written by hand containing information regarding the weather, economic conditions, wars, human interest stories. And although these were first known form of distributed written information, the country accredited with creating the first newspaper is Germany. In the late 15th century, a cross between a brochure and a pamphlet was dispersed among the people, and the text contained highly sensationalized stories along with description of current news events. And a lot of times, a lot of the stuff in there would be made up. To find a literate man was no easy task. After Europe was emerging from the Middle Ages, paper also was extremely expensive because they didn't have an easy way to make it. So it was hard to come across. And so the task of printing was long and laborious, and it took a while for the periodicals to catch on. In the early 1800s, the development of continuous rolls of paper enhanced the original Gutenberg press, as did a steam-powered press and a way to use iron instead of wood for building the press. So those inventions made a huge difference. The added efficiency of printing made the price of printing goods more reasonable. And so that brought us to what was known as the penny press. This phrase originated when newspaperman Benjamin Day dropped the price of his New York Sun to a penny in 1833. Historians have accredited the penny press as the first true mass medium. So here are the penny press. This is not to say that these newspapers were staid or sedate. True, they were dominated as they were by advertising and shipping news. They appear to have little more than bulletin boards for businesses in their communities. But their editorials, which they took great pride in, were strongly partisan, provocative, and ill-tempered. Editors often attacked one another ferociously in print, and sometimes that carried right out into the streets. And there are stories of editors having fistfights and duels and all kinds of other things. So we saw all kinds of things in these penny presses and periodicals. In February of 1850, the first issue of the Lady's Book by Lewis Godey, publisher, declared, in 1830, a magazine of elegant literature was cast, doubtably upon the uncertain stream of public favor. Its name, the Lady's Book, and Louis Godey, the publisher. It was a novel enterprise at the time, and few thought it would outlive the first year of its nativity. It soon became apparent, however, that its management was in the hands of one who knew the want of the time and had the tact and taste required for its supply. So that's how he kind of looked back on what eventually became sort of the Ladies' Home Journal. Now, what was kind of cool about these is that he had 150 different women working in their homes to apply watercolor to every single plate. So as the exact hue and sometimes the color itself, if she ran out of paint, would change, it was left up to each painter to decide. So there's lots of variations. If you ever go to like 7 Mile Fair or an antique store and you find, one of these plates, these are really quite beautiful and definitely worth framing. Godey explained to his readers as an opportunity for them to compare plates and see how a particular garment could look in a various shade. These plates were continue to be collector's items, and so are some of those missing from the volumes because people would take them out. And here you would see something like in black and white before it would get printed or inked. Another famous magazine that we still have actually today is the Scribner's Monthly, and there we can see a copy of it. And I think that's where we're going to stop for now. And next time we're going to look at the Industrial Revolution and how all of these changes kind of were brought into one place at the Crystal Palace by Prince Albert. So until next time,